The metaphor for me for the race for electrification is effectively a really imbalanced or unbalanced group of participants in a race that are of varying different skills, capabilities, and one specifically is massively disadvantaged. So there's a consolidation of demand into a single resource, which is the electrical power from the electrical grid. And the way the picture formed in my head, and it's kind of developed, is a race is generally perceived as you start line. You might have slight variance in performance of the participants, but generally, if you're at a certain level, you race against people that are broadly equal. Races in motor vehicles, they have very tight specs so that everyone's given a fair chance. And I think the way I wanted to draw the picture was, if you can imagine this starting line on an athletics track or whatever else, and the announcer calls out the different sectors. Data centers get a call, and you get this athletic, ripped, muscular, fit, confident person coming, really focused. You get and all the various sectors, and then you end up with residential and industrial, commercial, and EV, and all these other different new demands on the electrical grid come out at various levels of fitness and capability. I think the thing that I wanted to draw out is that residential market is structurally disadvantaged in pretty much every criteria in the race for electrification. So I started to say, can you imagine calling out residential? They walk out backwards, they've got a blindfold on, a walking stick, bit of a sore leg, an asthma inhaler, haven't quite got the fitness, and the gun goes off. It's almost like the organisers of the race are quite happy with that imbalance. Now, that's no one's fault. It's just a fact of the race for electrification. I don't think anyone says electrification is not a good idea. I think the race for net zero is absolutely a good idea. So it is what it is, and it's a way of explaining that, unpacking it, and then what do we do about it? So I think that's it. It's become a good metaphor, a good way of explaining it. There's various statistics. There's obviously ways of doing it mathematically, or in terms of size, scale, pace, funding, planning, public perception. All these different criteria you can talk about. Someone said we're in the third electrical infrastructure revolution, and the previous two are the introduction of the electrical grid and then the super grid decades ago. And that's not an unfair statement to make. If you look at a revolution in terms of significant scale, change, and so on, it definitely fits the criteria. So when we look at the grid, and again, it is no one's fault. It's structurally been fine. It's lacked investment because primarily we were so focused on competition in the electrical market that we removed the requirements or the ability for distribution network operators, the likes of UK Power Networks, Scottish and Southern, and so on, the businesses that have been around for many years in various guises. We removed the need or the ability for them to forward invest. So basically everyone had to play on the same playing field, which has enabled our businesses to exist. So people say, why hasn't this happened? Why hasn't this been going? Decision was made. We've had the benefit. We've been happy to have better performance and so on. So we can't really be too critical about that because it was always there. So what has happened is, again, everyone funneling into electricity as an energy source makes perfect sense. We've got the fastest decarbonising grid in the world. So just by selecting electricity anyway, you're piggybacking on the success of the grid. But the reality is, the physical, practical reality of what the grid needs to do in the next 10 to 20 years, the orders of magnitude of investment, we keep talking in billions of pounds, and it feels like, as long as we find the money, it'll be fine. That money has got to translate into equipment, planning, organisation, labour, excavation, tarmac, white lining, road opening notices. The detail of how that money's expended and the physical resources able to do that is where it really hits the buffers. The other thing is the grid, as it stands at the moment, has to be updated in all its levels, from transmission, distribution, right the way down to the local level. And that, again, requires a lot of coordination between those pieces. And I've got to say, National Grid as a ESO, which is the top level organisation, are doing some fantastic things to ease the issue, because the other thing is to use the grid more effectively than it's ever been used. It's been a pretty passive grid. Basically energy goes in, people take energy out. We're starting to wrestle with the fact that the billions of pounds of infrastructure might be better spent on using it better over 24 hours, different times of the day, sharing electricity by various means as a nation rather than sort of small pockets, so you can become part of a community. There was other things. It's hundreds of thousands of kilometres of cable have got to be laid, and it's an eye-wateringly large investment required. You have to talk about the power requirements in terms of things that people can picture, and entry-level data centres, sort of run-of-the-mill that you could build all day long, is 13,000 houses. We've got sites that in our TriConnect business that are 6,500 units that will take 30 years to build. So you're talking about a 60-year build on a standard development. And bearing in mind we've never hit 300,000 houses as a UK. If you compare what a percentage of our annual target, hit or not, a data centre can be, you start getting into the very large data centres, you can double, treble, and you're into city level power consumption in one building. The other thing with data centres is the profile of the power consumption. So we've got some like EV charging hubs. They need a lot of potential power for when everyone's using it at the same time. Peak power is important. Data centres, they set a level of power and they consume it 24/7, 365, year after year after year after year, because the demand for data centres is so far beyond our ability to deliver them worldwide that anything we can build as far as a data centre will just get consumed. They'll get tenants in instantly. So if a data centre, like we have 3 in West London, and I struggle to understand why, from a construction background, practical background, why on earth would you put these high consuming buildings in West London where you're constrained by highways? There's one that's planning to dig up the Euston Road for miles and miles and miles and miles. Huge, massive excavation required. And I've spoken to some professionals in that sector, and there's 2 types of data centres that I understand now. One of them is a transactional data centre, and that's hugely aligned with the financial markets and stock market, and you're into micro fractions of a second trading differences with these guys. They're unbelievable. But they need 3 data centres to have the same transaction to operate on at the same time for disaster recovery, resilience, and so on. And they need to be close, because you can't allow for a long distance for that transaction to come back and forth. So that's why you have 3 data centres in a group around a hub of stock market banking, which is why Dublin, London, all the places where we've got large financial markets or transactional markets require those very, very close data centres in 3s. The other part of data centres, so that's transactional, is the brains of AI. Now, AI requires a lot of, the equivalent of a computer sitting there going, let me think, let me learn. And that, that's what everyone thinks is AI is sort of self-generative. It learns and continuously builds. That just requires raw data, processing power. Now, the location of that is less important. So what you've got is these 2 flexible things. One, you need to be close to your customers. The other one, you can put them anywhere, which is why you've got data centres in Iceland where you've got huge amounts of renewable power, relatively low temperature. But that can sit there or anywhere. So we will have the next rash of data centres to go in the UK will be of the AI, still demand for transactions, but you'll start to see data centres in locations that haven't been utilised. We know the impact on an area. It can sterilise huge swathes of the network, and the demand is not slowing. You can look at it and go, well, this is never going to work. You're going to see a coming together of the demand, a failure to be able to meet it, and the system will collapse. That's very, very unlikely. And the grid is almost like an organic, multi-level organism. And with a residential developer who needs the equivalent of a 300 plot site, equivalent of a small EV charging hub, having someone to look at the grid position, making sure that you're ahead of the game. There are things you can do. Using the flexibility in EV charging for possible battery storage. We haven't seen batteries really coming into the grid resilience yet. We saw Octopus get selected as the first energy provider to work with the grid to do demand side response. So there's lots of people doing lots of things, and they will all help, as well as we have got to bury loads more cables, we've got to put more towers on, we've got to run more circuits, and we've got to put more generation. We've still got work to do on the decarbonisation. So I think there's enough focus from enough people, but the reality for developers, no matter what colour, what sector, whatever, is they need to engage the grid early and continuously through their development. And you know, we've spoken about it before. We've had customers that have had a completed structure with no power. And for me, I say to guys, if your grid capacity and your grid connection is not equally level with your planning permission on your risk register, you're missing it. Because a site with planning but no power, I would suggest, isn't as valuable as you might think. I think one of the things that we've decided to do is to try and speak to all the parties in this. And one of the parties we realised that weren't getting spoken to were the investors, banks, lenders in any form. And even at the conference that we attended the other day, I had the opportunity to speak to one of the challenger banks, had a few directors there, and it's quite evident and quite quickly evident that they don't include power in their due diligence when they're lending money. And as soon as I said, so it's planning, it's can you buy the land unencumbered and so on, but if you've got no grid capacity, how's the money going to come back in? Doesn't take more than 2 or 3 sentences to go, that needs to be added. And again, we'll assist with that and we'll explain how and what questions to ask, and we're also challenging them to fund SMEs in a different way so they can engage with the grid. Because SMEs, you know, if residential developers are disadvantaged, SMEs are double so. And I said at a conference the other day, every PLC in that building was an SME once. And we need, as an industry, we need a vibrant SME market. And at the moment, we've got to do something, and we're trying to do something to assist them further, because otherwise we're going to become a bit homogenised as a sector.